Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to ARA's Webinar Wednesday. I'm Sri Rao, your moderator for today's webinar titled Accessibility for All, Section 508 Compliance. And this is the topic that impacts all of our work. So I'm sure you will all take a significant amount of interesting nuggets from today's presentation by Lisa Schofield. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, my colleague and friend, Lisa Schofield. Lisa serves as a Senior Marketing and Communications Coordinator for ARA and is a certified trusted tester for Section 508 compliance under the Department of Homeland Security DHS Customer Experience Directorate, CXC. Prior to joining ARA, Ms. Schofield produced international award-winning videos, facilitated educational technology webinar trainings, and hosted interactive collaborative small group meetings with regional educational technology coordinators. She has directed live broadcast and web streamed events with multiple pay-per-view breakout session options and provided full production services for a variety of live and pre-recorded events, from studio broadcasts to red carpet events and stage production. So as you can see, she has a pretty deep resume. She received the Global Call to Action Award in 2011 in partnership with the Chautauqua Learn and Serve Charter School for Students with Disabilities. And she has a deep appreciation and commitment to promoting the value of quote unquote accessibility for all individuals. So Lisa, I'm happy to introduce you and please take it over from here.
Thanks, Sri. As you mentioned, I have worked in creative media, video production, graphic design for most of my career. Today, I'll focus more on the technical side of editing, specifically for accessibility purposes. But I think having that background in creative media helps me to look for ways to meet accessibility needs without sacrificing creativity. In today's webinar, Accessibility for All, I'd like to focus on accessibility from the end user's perspective. What are some things that can be done to improve communication or boost accessibility for your intended audience, whether you're sharing content on a website application, an ebook, or an electronic document? I'll go into some of the WCAG guidelines, which stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. You'll hear that a lot today. And I'll let you know what those are, where you can find them. I'm going to test your knowledge a little bit. From time to time, I'll ask you a question and poll the audience, and this will help me to know if I need to go into more detail or explain something a little bit better. At the end of the presentation, I'll share some resources that you may want to reference for later. I obviously won't be able to cover everything there is to know about accessibility, but I'll share from an end user's perspective what I believe will help you reach a broader audience. And keep in mind that the user could be someone with a disability, but it could also be someone who is working in an environment where there's a lot of noises or distractions, or someone who's using a mobile device or a screen reader while they travel. There are lots of reasons that accessibility features are useful for communicating electronically. Section 508 compliance. That's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was the first major federal law that prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities. The law guarantees equal access to employment, education, healthcare, and other services. It also requires that federal agencies and contractors provide reasonable accommodations to avoid discrimination based on a disability. The Section 508 amendment was added in 1998 to include discrimination as it applies to accessing information through electronic media. Section 508 requires that all web pages, documents, and electronic information shared by the federal government should be accessible to everyone. And then in 2017, the U.S. Access Board updated the accessibility requirements with more focus on the actual functionality and referenced the WCAG 2.0 as the federal standard for accessibility. The WCAG guidelines are available online. There are several places that you can find them, but the quick reference site is the one that I have bookmarked on my desktop. There's a QR code if you want to scan it now. That link will also be included in the resources that I'll share at the end. This quick reference site lists all of the WCAG guidelines and success criteria and techniques to help identify potential accessibility issues. Take just a minute to look at this image. This probably represents the way that most of us started our approach towards Section 508 compliance. Or at least speaking for myself, I had good intentions, but there are some accessibility considerations that I just couldn't relate to because they didn't directly impact me. If you can imagine yourself as a person that's at the top of these stairs in a wheelchair or with crutches, or maybe a parent with a baby stroller or riding a bicycle, the details on the specifications for a ramp, they matter, right? When I started to imagine myself from the perspective of someone who relies on accessibility tools to read instructions, complete an online course, or to fill out a form, it changed the way that I address accessibility and 508 compliance. As a matter of fact, last year, I temporarily lost my eyesight for months. During that time, I got to experience how isolating it can be if you can't communicate. Relying on screen readers and voice to text without the ability to verify or double check for accuracy, it can be frustrating and a little scary. I guess now would be a good time to also point out that the information I'm sharing today comes from my research, my experience, and my training. I'm not representing a government agency or any legal authority. I'm just sharing some things that I think will help you to move the bar when it comes to Section 508 compliance. Accessibility for information and communication technology, or ICT. It should be perceivable. It should be able to be seen, heard, or noticed. It should be operable, able to be used. The functions that are required to open or navigate a report or web page, for example, should be as universal as possible. It should be understandable. The language and the reading order of the information should be logical and capable of being understood or comprehended. And it should be robust. It should be able to withstand or overcome adverse conditions. It should be compatible with operating systems or devices that are receiving the ICT. These are the 4 guiding principles that outline the WCAG accessibility guidelines. The 4 principles of the guidelines and specific success criteria for addressing issues that could potentially cause accessibility failures are listed on the screen, kind of the overview of the broad categories. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I do want you to know that the amount of guidance is available, and keep in mind that this list is just for the first principle. I'll highlight a few today, but when you work with an accessibility professional or 508 specialist, that person is actually validating against each individual criteria that's listed here. The first guideline that I want to address is actually WCAG 1.1.1 alt text. Non-text content, including images, equations, graphic elements, should all have equivalent alt text. These elements add meaning and provide context to help the reader perceive more about the topic. Alt text should be meaningful and describe what is visible in the photo. Equation alt text should be written as if you were reading it aloud to someone. So math symbols, for example, should be spelled out in sentence form. Alt text for graphics or charts should summarize the data or highlight trends that you would expect other readers to comprehend visually. It should be written by a subject matter expert or the author of the content, someone who can explain in a way that adds meaning and captures the intended context. Remember that a screen reader or assistive technology will read everything on the page aloud, so to avoid being repetitive, make sure that the alt text is written in a way that does not repeat the caption or the surrounding text. Don't include background information in the alt text if it's not visible in the image. For example, the date or location where a photo is taken, it should not be a part of the alt text. Maybe that should be in the caption instead. But if it's not visible in the image, then it should not be included in the alt text. Focus on providing an alternate text version of the visual images, of the visual elements that are in the image. That brings us to our first activity. So in activity 1, you'll see the poll question pop up on your screen. I want you to look at this picture and determine which of the following would represent the best option for alt text for this image. the best answer for this would be option C. And it looks like most of you got that right. So option A is vague and doesn't provide much detail. And option B is repetitive. It includes some of the same information that you see in the caption. Option D provides additional background information or details that are not actually a part of the visible image. So that makes option C the best of the ones that are shown. The next guideline for testing communication to see if it's perceivable pertains to sensory characteristics, such as shape, color, size, visual location, orientation, or sound. When you're giving instructions, be mindful of someone who can't differentiate color or maybe can't see at all. If the caption under the photo says something like, the state's highlighted in green, or if you provide instructions and refer to an object on the left or the object on the right, that information has no meaning to someone who can't see. Instructions or descriptions like these require the reader to use sensory characteristics to interpret the meaning. To make these examples more perceivable, the instructions should be more descriptive or include labels that are clearly defined. Like instead of referring to the image on the left or the image on the right, maybe label them image A and image B. That way you can clarify without relying on sensory characteristics in your description. And that brings us to our next activity. For sensory characteristics, take a look at the image and the caption or the surrounding text. From the following options, identify the sensory characteristics accessibility issue. So in this example, the caption actually reads, the U.S. states highlighted in yellow participated in the activity. That information would require the reader to be able to differentiate the color yellow, using sensory characteristics. So the correct answer is B. So next, I want to talk about the use of color. Consider someone who's colorblind or someone who may not be able to differentiate specific colors. Or depending on the monitor or projector resolution, sometimes it can be difficult for anyone to correctly identify specific colors or color patterns. For that reason, color should never be the only way that you deliver information. Please know that this guideline does not mean that you cannot use color. As a matter of fact, if you're thinking that correcting the use of color by changing the image to black and white, that actually won't work. You still have various shades of gray that can be difficult to differentiate. So instead, try adding a unique pattern to each background color, use various line styles like dotted or dashed lines, or add labels to make sure that all of the information on the graphic or the image is clear without having to use color as the differentiator. So that brings us to our next poll question, activity 3. This image uses color as the only way to identify the approved design. But someone who is colorblind or has trouble differentiating colors might see something like this. So they would not be able to apply the legend to differentiate the approved from the rejected designs. Once we add a pattern, now you can see the legend and identify the correct answer. Which box represents the approved design? And by the way, you also have the option to use color as long as you also use the pattern. So that way, color is still not the only way to perceive the information. Design B is the correct answer. Now we're going to go straight into the next activity, or the next poll question. And this is another one for the use of color, but it's a little bit more difficult. So, which of these line graphs represents the best example for addressing use of color? And I'll give you a hint. Look at the legend and look at the graph. Which of these graphs would you be able to identify which line represents, let's say, series 1, for example, without actually having to use color? If you look at option B, it uses a unique pattern in the graph itself, but if you look at the legend underneath, it only uses color. So if you were So you can't use, you need to have that pattern also included in the legend below so that you could differentiate those patterns without having to distinguish color. So the correct option is option C. Next, I want to talk a little bit about color contrast. It's important to use color, to look at the use of color and color contrast to understand what's being evaluated under each one. Color contrast has to do with the color contrast ratio between the text and the background color. Normal text, including text on images, must meet the minimum contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1. Or if you use large text, it's a little bit lower ratio of 3 to 1. But you don't have to worry about doing the math, and there's a really simple free eyedropper tool that is that you can download and save on your desktop. I'll share the link at the end of the presentation. So, but basically you just would use the eyedropper to select the foreground color, which is the color of the text, and use the eyedropper to select the background color, which you can pick anywhere on the screen as long as it's the color that represents the color that's right behind the text. And the results immediately will tell you whether or not that passes or fails the WCAG standard for contrast minimum for AA. So you don't even have to worry about those ratios. Just use the tool and it will tell you whether it passes or fails. So now we go to our next activity, our next poll question for color contrast. Which of these options fails the color contrast minimum guideline? And I'm sharing the results here from the color contrast analyzer tool to help you. The correct answer is orange. The orange text on the white background fails to meet color contrast minimum guideline. One more guideline that I'd like to talk about today under the perceivable principle is image of text. Screenshots or photos of text are not as clear as actual text, especially if you use a magnifying glass or you need to zoom in on the screen to actually read the text. Actual text is cleaner and it's able to be magnified without losing resolution. Also, actual text can be read aloud by a screen reader, so that's always preferable over an image of text, especially if the text is formatted as a table or as a list. There are a few exceptions that are allowable as an image of text. If the image is purely decorative and it's not meaningful to the content, then there's no need to recreate it as actual text. If the text is part of a logo or it's then that's acceptable as part of the image without being recreated as actual text. And if the text is contained within a picture that is essential to the visual content, for example, if the text is part of an infographic or part of a flow chart where the background shape is significant to the meaning, then that's okay to have it as text, have the text as part of the image. So now we go to our next poll question. Take a look at the images that are labeled A, B, C, and D. All 4 of the images contain text, but which one does not qualify as an exception? Which one of these 4 examples should be replaced with actual text? And the correct answer on this one is B, the screenshot of the table. Tables actually have column and row headers, and they use scope to assign cell content to the specific headers. The information in the table is difficult, if not impossible, to describe as alt text. So images or screenshots of tables should always be converted into actual text. Now we're moving on from perceivable and going to take a look at a few of the principal guidelines to validate operability. Starting with keyboard accessible. All of the functionality of the digital content should be operable with the use of a keyboard. If someone is physically unable to use a mouse, or if they just don't have access to one, they should still be able to navigate with keyboard shortcuts and using the tab or space bar without having to rely on a mouse. Here's one example. When you're filling out a registration form online, you would expect to be able to use the tab key to enter all of the information. In this sample form, Once the name is filled in, using the tab key, the cursor skips to the phone number field. If the mouse is required to access the address field, would this pass or fail to meet the criteria for keyboard accessible? Since we were not able to access the address field using the keyboard, this example fails to meet the requirements for keyboard accessible. So the correct answer is B. Flashing content can trigger migraines, dizziness, nausea, or seizures. So if you're using flashing content, it's very important to pay attention to the guidelines for operability. Any blinking or flashing content on a web page or presentation should not exceed 3 flashes per second. Bright red can also cause photosensitivity issues. So don't use the pure saturated shade of red for any of your flashing content. There's an additional threshold limit guidance available online for exceptions allowed for objects that are smaller than 25% or any 10-degree visual field of a typical viewing distance. To keep it simple, I would just suggest that you don't exceed the 3 flashes per second and make sure that you avoid using bright red. If your content does not meet those 2 requirements, then please refer to WCAG 2.3 guidance for seizures and physical reactions to calculate the percentage of visual field before publishing anything. So now we're going to our next activity, activity 8, for 3 flashes. In this example, the cursor is flashing at 2 times per second. So does this example pass or fail the WCAG guideline for 3 flashes? And the correct answer is A, it passes. 2 more guidelines that impact operability. These are both related to navigation, and that's the focus order. The focus order impacts the order in which elements receive focus and are read aloud by a screen reader. Typically, that's from left to right, top to bottom, but the order should be logical. So, for example, if images, source credits, and captions are read in should be read in a consistent order throughout the web page or document. Headings and labels are required to maintain a logical reading order and provide an outline that is navigable for someone to be able to use voice commands or assistive technology to navigate through sections or chapters. I recently ordered an audiobook that did not have chapter markers. That might not have been a problem if I intended to sit and read the entire book in one sitting, but that's not how most people read, or at least that's definitely not how everyone reads a book. So having those chapter markers would make it where I was able to leave the book and come back and be able to find where I left off. Moving on now to understandable, capable of being comprehended. The first one is the first one we'll talk about is language. You want to verify that the default language is defined as the actual language that you're intending to use. So the default is usually English, but when you copy and paste text from other documents, there can be other languages that are embedded. That could affect the pronunciation of words or the interpretation of how certain characters, like accent characters, are presented or how they're pronounced. Dictionaries can also translate the meaning in a different way if the embedded language is set to something besides English. Another way to make sure that your content is understandable is to use consistent navigation. Navigation menus that are repeated on multiple pages should appear in the same order in the same location to make your web page easier to navigate. So activity 10, on this example web page, I've actually modified the navigation menu just to demonstrate. On this first page, the navigation menu reads, who are we, what do we do, products, and then contact us. And then on the second page, the navigation menu is in a different order. This is an example of which WCAG accessibility failure. And the correct answer on this one is consistent navigation. Another way that you can make sure that your web content is understandable is to use consistent identification. Components like icons, labels, or hyperlinks that are used in more than one place and have the same functionality or meaning should be identified consistently. For example, several pages in this presentation contain a hyperlink to the WCAG success criteria. If I rename that link on different pages so that sometimes it's called a 508 resource page and other times it's called the quick reference, how would you know that the hyperlinks are all pointing to the same site? And our next activity, in this example for demonstration purposes, I've modified the text labels for the icons. The icons are repeated but have different unique labels on each page. This is an example of which WCAG accessibility failure. And the correct answer here is consistent identification. Okay. The fourth and final accessibility principle is your web page should be robust or compatible. One of the criteria that's worth taking a close look at here is new in the WCAG 2.1 guidelines. And that is the important status messages contain role properties that are to be presented even without receiving focus. That means that if someone accesses a page with a subscription option or a shopping cart that could trigger a financial transaction, there is a requirement for the user to confirm the request before the transaction happens. The status message must be accessible. The user should not have to hover over or navigate to that message to hear it. Computer technology and electronic delivery is constantly evolving. As new software and new devices are introduced to the market, our capabilities to transmit and receive information will likely change. Giving careful consideration to the 4 principles and the WCAG guidelines should improve accessibility, not only for people with disabilities, but for everyone. Here are the resources that I talked about during the presentation. There are many tools and resources that are available online to help you identify accessibility needs or to learn more about the guidelines for addressing Section 508 compliance. But here's a few. The first link and the QR code are to the WCAG Success Criteria Quick Reference Guide. It provides a full description of each one of the guidelines and some techniques to identify and address failures. The color contrast tool analyzer tool is the eyedropper that I demonstrated during the presentation. It's a free download. It's an eyedropper tool, and you can quickly identify colors, whether colors pass or fail. And it sits on your desktop, so it's kind of on top of any application that you're using. So you can use it for web page design, for PDF documents, for Word documents, anything that you need to test the color contrast for. And then there's the DHS Section 508 testing. If you're interested in becoming a trusted tester or an accessibility specialist, and you really want to learn a lot more about the guidelines, then I recommend that you go to this website, and that's where the Trusted Tester training and certification program is housed. There's also another Webinar Wednesday video that's available on the ARA YouTube channel. The title is 508 Compliance, Creating Accessible Documents. That video focused mostly on the document formatting and how to address some of the most common accessibility issues in Word and PDF formats. It was recorded 5 years ago, but the information in it is still relevant. So feel free to check that one out if you would like to. And with that, I will turn it back over to Shri.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was extremely interesting and useful to me as a practitioner of some of these works. You may now begin submitting your questions in the chat box, and Lisa will answer as many questions as possible in the time remaining. Lisa referenced the previous Webinar Wednesday covering 508 compliance, and all of ARA's Webinar Wednesday recordings are available at this website, www.ara.com/webinars. This is also the same place where you would register for upcoming webinars. You can just scroll down to see the webinars that are listed in the past webinars archive, and the date of the webinar that Lisa just referenced is February 26th, 2020. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation and that you will join ARA for future webinars. On March 12th, Dr. Phil Donovan will present ADA ramp and sidewalk inspections and the new ADA ramp serviceability index. So that presentation on March 12th. And then on April 9th, Dr. Abu Sufyan and Dr. Ted Argo will talk about possibilities of quiet pavements in reducing road traffic noise. So like I said before, we have webinars scheduled every month, and stay tuned for more webinars that will come up. We have many more exciting topics in the works, and we're planning for webinars. So please watch your email for updates or visit the Webinar Wednesday webpage at www.ara.com/webinars. On slide 17, on US map with color. Oh, sorry, slide 15. I apologize. You mentioned you can't use color in the description. So what is the best way to address the 508 issue for sensory characteristics in this example?
That's actually a great question. There are two issues with this map, and we've talked about both of them in the presentation. There's the use of color, and then also the sensory characteristics. For sensory characteristics, to address that, you can actually just drop the word yellow from the instructions and say something like, this map highlights states that participated in the activity by responding to the poll question. So just by removing the word yellow, so you're just saying, hey, the states that are highlighted are the ones, then that addresses the sensory characteristic issue. And for use of color, because this one does use yellow and white, so it's a use of color issue as well. You can address that one by inserting a pattern, or actually just simply removing the state labels from the ones that didn't participate, so that only the states that participated had the state labels. So there's two different ways also to address the use of color in that one. But for sensory characteristics, just don't use the word yellow in the description there.
I think you mentioned images of text with the slide. Can you give some examples of decorative images that might contain text?
Actually, on this page, throughout the slide here, or the slide deck, the corner that says Webinar Wednesdays, that could be decorative. Now, if it's got text on it, then that Webinar Wednesdays is actually defined on the opening screen in this PowerPoint presentation. But on all of the pages after that, it has that logo or image in the top corner. It would be distracting for the reader to hear that read aloud each time that you went to a new slide. So that could actually be distracting to include alt text for it every time. So once it's been identified, then it could be decorative for the rest of the presentation without having to duplicate that content. So that's one example of a decorative image with text.
All right, thank you. So there's a question on the chat about heat maps or contour plots. So what is the 508 approach to heat maps in research projects that use a lot of heat maps or contour plots, for example, to describe sea level rise or temperature across something or stresses? What is your guidance on that?
Heat maps are always a challenge because they do use color, and a lot of times there's a gradient image. That color kind of makes a really difficult to, it makes it difficult to differentiate. There are a couple of options. If you have an alternate way to provide the information, maybe in the appendix, if there's a table or chart or something that could also outline the information or the data that's presented in the heat map, then that's one option, and that is to have an alternate version that's also added to the appendix, and then you could actually link to that and say, hey, if you can't read this map, then you could get the same information here. One of the things, you know, a lot of times those are kind of, you're not really necessarily expecting, especially in a research report, if you don't really expect the reader to be able to pull the data from that image, you're just using it kind of as a sample image of some of the report data that you've collected, then you could simply remove the, remove the legend. If you're providing the color legend and you're saying, hey, these are the colors that are used in this heat map, and that's the way that you're expecting someone to be able to differentiate the sections of the map, then you're using color to convey information. So that's really, you've got to have another way of summarizing that information or providing that same information that is perceived in the heat map, so that color isn't the only way. So those definitely provide a challenge. Hope that answered your question.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Another question from Scott is, my office produces many reports that contain blueprints or shop drawings for fabrication purposes, and they've been asked to make those documents 508 compliant. Any recommendations for the best way to convert something that's so inherently visual into a 508 compliant document?
That is a good question. I would have to see the actual blueprints, but just kind of give you some general feedback on that. A lot of times you would be able to, because I know that labeling could get really, labeling all of the elements within the image could get really, could bog down the image pretty quickly, and you have a lot of, makes it hard to read. If there are, you could possibly use the patterns, or not only for the solid blueprint sections of the drawing, but also different line styles for outlining different sections, or icons that represent different areas of the blueprints. You have those typically have a lot of information, so it's a little bit on a case-by-case basis, but I think a lot of times your first reference is to think about patterns, and having a lot of different patterns in an image could also be very distracting. So remember that line styles is also, like, having dotted or dashed lines to outline different sections, or to point to different sections is also an option. And labeling, you can have a legend over to the side that lines up with an alphabetized labeling pattern that you could reference for each section.
All right, thank you. And I understand, Lisa, that if you have things like dimensions and things like that, as long as it's a file that can read that, I think that would make it compliant as well, right? Those numbers.
Right.
There's a kind of a follow-on question from a different person about the heat map answer you provided. In the event that the information cannot be presented in a different manner on heat maps, do you have any thoughts on best color combinations that could be used, or something like that could be an alternative?
Well, using using color is still an issue. So if you could, depending on how much detail and how much color variation there is on the heat map, you might be able to use patterns that would differentiate different sections of the heat map. Providing the legend with the colors, you're really relying on that color to pick up some specific detail out of that map. So if your purpose is to be more general, that this is a map example, then you can describe it in the alt text without having the legend for reference. So, because then you're providing that same information, whether someone is able to see the colors or not see the colors, there's still kind of a general reference for the heat maps. Heat maps are a problem. I mean, they're very difficult to translate without using color. So if there are some, in some cases there may be a heat map that's available that's online that is that's interactive and it's HTML based, and that way the user can navigate it without can navigate the map and pull out certain sections where the alt text or the text for that image actually is specific to the section that you're highlighting, so you're not using the color to do that. I mean, that's really ideal, is to have that heat map in an HTML based version, and then your document could actually reference that version that is interactive and that has all of the shares all of the information and does not rely on color to convey it.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And as an engineer who has used heat maps in my documents, I think if I'm paraphrasing your answer, it really is up to the person who developed the document to figure out what is the purpose of the heat map. If the purpose of the heat map is just to say, hey, here's a example of a heat map, and then you could say that in the alt text. And then if the purpose is to specifically identify points on the heat map, then that could also be noted somewhere in the text, correct? That's correct. I think that's all the questions online. Thank you very much for if you have any further follow-up questions. I know there's a few there is a question here. Sorry, Lisa, we have a few minutes. I'll go ahead. Is there a minimum font size for documents? I think it should be simple, straightforward.
There is not for specifically in Section 508 compliant in the WCAG guidelines, but there a lot of times there is in the within the requirements of the specific client that you're working with, or the specific publisher that's going to be publishing. There are often there's some different guidance that's out there, but it's not specifically in the WCAG standards. So there are some recommendations, and it really kind of depends on how the information is being presented. So it varies if you're talking about a presentation font size versus a text font size. So that comes down to more the style guide than the WCAG requirements.
All right, thank you. If we did not get your question, I think we answered all the questions that were online. But if you have any follow-up, Lisa has agreed to answer questions for the next 24 hours via email. And that's her email address, lschofield@ara.com. We just ask that you make sure your questions are not of the consulting nature. On behalf of ARA, thank you for joining us today. Today's presentation is recorded, and a link will be made available on the ARA Webinar Wednesday website sometime next week. We will also send a PDH certificate to all participants verified by our attendance report as present for the full hour of the webinar. A copy of today's presentation will also be included. Please allow at least 3 weeks to receive your certificate. ARA is a great company to work for and very unique in that it's 100% employee owned. We continue to grow dynamically and are always looking for great people to join our team. So if you're interested in employment opportunities with ARA's transportation and infrastructure offices, please send a brief resume and contact information to www.joinara@ara.com. Thank you for joining today, and we hope you will join us on March 12th for our next webinar Wednesday. So that's not a full month from now, it's literally a couple of weeks from now. March 12th for ADA ramp and sidewalk inspections and the new ADA ramp serviceability index. So thank you very much, all of you, and have a great rest of your day.